The evolution of emotions is something that Charles Darwin himself explored. Darwin is seen as the founder of the evolutionary approach to emotions. He said that emotions were evolutionarily evolved and that they were here to serve an important survival purpose. He actually argued that emotions have evolved via natural selection and serve this purpose for human survival and helping aid in communications and bonds with others. For Darwin, emotion had an evolutionary history that could be traced across cultures and species. In 1872, he published his landmark book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This book was immediately the bestseller of its time, over 5,000 copies, which was a lot in those days. It was considered the first scientific treatment of emotion. It included survey data, observations of both healthy and mentally ill individuals looking at healthy and unhealthy emotions. Darwin analyzed emotional responses in animals. He compared such responses in a variety of species and proposed that expressions of emotion evolved in an organism so as to signal to other organisms what it is about to do next. For example, when an animal is feeling threatened, it may display a stance of aggression. It may bare its teeth, it may lean forward, and it may make aggressive sounds. All of this behavior is to indicate violent behavior. And it does well in intimidating some percentage of other organisms nearby, which may then retreat in fear without necessitating actual combat. Thus, this type of behavior has a quantifiable impact on the organism's survival, and therefore becomes a preferable trait within the gene pool. To give a brief about how Darwin approached the evolution of emotions, we can think of three main principles that he talked about to help explain the origins of emotions. 1. The principle of serviceable or useful habit. 2. Principle of antithesis. 3. Principle of involuntariness, nervous discharge. The first principle, the principle of serviceable or useful habit, which is very important in understanding how emotions have evolved. Darwin argued that useful habits become reinforced over time. For example, think of the emotion of disgust. Disgust is pretty useful in helping deter us away from ingesting substances or toxins that might make us feel ill. So we have disgust as an emotion because it serves as a useful or serviceable habit for us. The second principle of antithesis. While some emotional habits are useful, like the case of disgust, other emotions are what Darwin called emotional habits to occur merely because they are their opposite or antithesis. For example, if you encounter some opposite situation in which you typically elicit a habitual response, rotten food for instance, an opposite manner of the habit will occur, such as the opposite of the emotion of disgust. This principle was the one that received perhaps the least attention of all three. The third principle of involuntariness, nervous discharge, where some involved behaviors or habits are performed as the result of built-up energy in the nervous system, and this will lead to nervous discharge, as Darwin put it, for example. When you're in an extreme situation of threat where you feel fear, he would say you will have what he called a nervous discharge of screaming. In more modern-day situations, like, for example, you are sitting with a boss or someone that you are very uncomfortable around, and your nervous discharge might just be even your leg shaking or your arms trembling. So he would say this is the third principle where some evolved behaviors or habits are performed as a result of this built-up energy in our nervous system. Darwin considered most of our emotional expressions are innate, but he did argue as well that not all emotional expressions are sort of instinctive, that there are some things which would say, like kissing, for example, that are learned but are used to fulfill a more evolutionarily primal desire. So most of our expressions are instinctive, but those that are not are things we learn to fulfill more evolutionarily or instinctive needs. The EA, or the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, is another important concept in understanding emotions' evolution. The EEA is the environment that forms sort of the origins of humankind, and it is where emotions are thought to have first evolved. So what is an accurate picture of the environment in which human emotions are first developed or originated? In an attempt to answer this question, researchers in this field of study often try to look into other pre-industrial societies, like hunter-gatherers societies, to think about what might be close analogies that might help explain some of our early emotional heritage. Some of the EEA properties are vulnerability of offspring, monogamous bonds, emergence of caring and compassion, flattening of social hierarchy, need for collective action. The EEA has many properties that seem to give rise to social emotions ranging from compassion and love to cooperative behaviors and feelings. The EEA also resulted in some selection pressures that favored certain genes more than others, and these genes drive which emotions to become adaptive and universal across all human beings. Vulnerability of offspring. After infants are born, they are highly dependent on their caregiver for a long period of time before they can function independently. So, because as humans we are very dependent on our caregivers for many years, it is really important to have emotions that are sort of built into us that help us want to care for our young and offspring. In other words, emotions like compassion or pro-social feelings of nurture and love became really important in our early history as a vital part of promoting this long-term care of offspring in hunter-gatherer societies. So what seems to be the case is that EA would be the kind of environment where compassion and love would be really important emotions. The second property, which is monogamous bonds. Human society seems to have a strong underlying tone of monogamy or long-term commitment to a partner to help rear this vulnerable offspring. An interesting comparison that suggests the evolutionary nature of emotions is that the monogamous bonds for humans are actually in contrast to those of bonobos, such as having sexual intercourse often and with many other monkeys. Bonobos often do this to ease aggression. Any conflict in the bonobo society is addressed with sexual resolution, yet this behavior did not seem to save them from being an endangered species. For humans, that is often less the case, maybe for the most part, at least for rearing offspring. This monogamous is really important. So we need to have emotions sort of built in us that enable us to be connected in a long-term way to a partner to help care and sort of rear these offspring. The third property, which is the emergence of caring and compassion. Part of this is because hominids live longer, so there were older people who also required caring. So it is both the existence of vulnerable offspring, infants and young children, as well as older people who have led to societies where it is really important to take care of others who are vulnerable. So these emotions of caring for others and having compassion is a vital part of our early origins. The fourth property of the EEA, flattening of social hierarchy. Researchers suggest that the social hierarchy in hunter-gatherer societies is fairly egalitarian. We see hominid groups of 75 to 100 individuals are pretty egalitarian in a sense. Jed Diamond, a researcher on the topic, argued that it is not until more recently, with the development of agriculture and excess food production, that has led us away from our egalitarian roots. The fifth property of the EEA, which is need for collective action. As a result of living in these large egalitarian groups, a central and important part of society includes cooperating with others. Researchers Leda Cosmides and John Tobey from UC Santa Barbara, who focus on the evolutionary approach to emotion, mentioned that emotion is the statistical composite of selection pressures that cause the genes underlying design of an adaptation to increase in frequency until they became species typical or stably persistent. The mind is composed of various modules or mini-programs to solve recurring evolutionary issues. Programs are turned on/triggered by certain elicitors in our environment. Paul Ekman listed 6 features of what an emotion is from an evolutionary perspective. 1. Brief. 2. Unbidden. 3. Cross-species. 4. Coherent. 5. Fast. 6. Automatic appraisal. Psychoevolutionary theory, PET, asserts that humans' positive reaction in nature is programmed evolutionarily. Nature was the first place humans learned to survive by gathering the resources around us, just as our evolutionary ancestors did. Because of evolution demands, which mostly include survival and reproduction, humans have built in positive reactions to natural environments. PET explains how being in nature can reduce stress and improve your mood, but doesn't fully explain how being in nature improves cognitive performance. Can nature make you smarter? Evolutionary approaches to emotions have traditionally focused on a subset of shared emotions with other species, characterized by distinct signals, and designed to solve a few key adaptive problems. An evolutionary psychological approach broadens the range of adaptive problems emotions have evolved to solve. Additionally, it includes emotions that lack distinctive signals and appears to be unique to humans, and it synthesizes an evolutionary approach with an information processing perspective. A number of pathways carry signals from the amygdala to structures in the brainstem that control the emotional response, like the hypothalamus, which directs the sympathetic response, and the periaqueductal gray matter of the midbrain that directs the behavioral response. The amygdala is not a singular structure. It is a cluster of nuclei, which is why sometimes we refer to it as the amygdaloid complex. Each of these regions serves a different function, as has been evidenced by studies on fear, demonstrating that the lateral nucleus is involved with conditioned fear, while the central nucleus controls defensive behavior and so forth. There are 3 kinds of major divisions of the brain that are thought to be included in emotion, so this included first the limbic system, the hypothalamus, amygdala, and nucleus accumbens, and several other nearby areas. Second is the striatal system, or striatum. It includes the putamen, the caudate nucleus, nucleus accumbens, and it is divided into both the dorsal and ventral striatum. This is often thought of as the reward center of the brain, so it's often associated with the experience of pleasure or reward. The third is the neocortex. This is the outer layer of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is in the front part of the brain, and it's often thought of as the prefrontal cognitive control region is thought to be involved in the regulation or control of emotion. From the standpoint of cognitive neuroscience, there is still much work to be done surrounding the brain mechanism of human emotion. It appears that the brain activity associated with each individual emotion is not highly localized, but it is rather diffuse. Each emotion or even empathy experience when observing others' emotional states is accompanied by activity in the motor cortex and sensory cortex. Brain imaging studies show that similar brain activity patterns are enacted whether a person experiences an emotion, imagine that emotion, or observe someone else experiencing that emotion.